The plane had just begun boarding, and the atmosphere inside the cabin carried the familiar mix of excitement and weariness that comes with travel. In the front, where the VIP seats promised comfort and exclusivity, the flight attendants were busy preparing for passengers who paid or earned their way into the luxury experience. Their polished smiles and professional manners were supposed to reflect the airline's highest standard of service, but behind the smiles, small cracks of bias were about to show. When the black executive stepped onto the plane, his presence immediately drew the eyes of the staff. He was dressed immaculately, his suit sharp, his demeanor calm, every detail signaling status, professionalism, and authority. He walked confidently toward the VIP section, his ticket in hand, yet the moment he took his seat, subtle exchanges began to pass between the crew members. One whispered remark, followed by stifled laughter, quickly revealed that his presence was not being treated with the respect it deserved. At first, the laughter was muted, a kind of private exchange that passengers might not notice. But to the executive, the tone was unmistakable. He caught the sideways glances, the suppressed smirks, the almost playful tone that had no place in professional conduct. It was not about humor or friendliness, it was about disbelief that someone who looked like him belonged there. The so-called hospitality crumbled into condescension, and though the staff tried to mask it, the truth of their prejudice hung thick in the air. He was not just a passenger in their eyes, he was an intruder in a space they thought was not his. The executive remained composed, aware that any sudden reaction could be twisted to his disadvantage. Years of navigating spaces where bias lurked beneath polished surfaces had taught him patience. But what unfolded in those first few minutes of boarding struck a deep chord. The staff's whispers were not random, they carried judgment, assumptions, and a cruel amusement that suggested his very presence in the VIP section was laughable. One attendant leaned in toward another, speaking just low enough to avoid being overheard by others, and both burst into muffled giggles as their eyes darted toward him. It was subtle, but it was cutting. The laughter was not about anything funny, it was about him. Around him, other passengers settled into their seats, pulling out books, adjusting luggage, or preparing for the flight. Most were oblivious to the exchange, but the executive could feel the shift in energy. It was not paranoia, it was the sharp, cold recognition of being mocked for who he was, not for anything he had done. The staff's role was to make every passenger feel welcome, yet here they were, reducing him to the subject of ridicule in a section meant to symbolize prestige. Their actions betrayed a deep prejudice wrapped in the disguise of light-hearted behavior. But beneath the surface, their laughter was a rejection of his success, a denial of his right to belong where he had worked hard to be. The moment stretched longer than they should have. What should have been a smooth, uneventful welcome turned into a tense experience, with each burst of quiet laughter ringing louder in his ears. The executive remained outwardly calm, but his silence was not weakness. It was calculation. He studied their behavior, the way their eyes avoided direct contact after each whisper, the way they clutched at professionalism but failed to hold on to it. He noticed every detail, every smirk, every sign that respect had been replaced with mockery. This was not just about one flight. This was a reflection of something larger, the deeply ingrained belief among some that wealth, power, and status could not possibly belong to someone like him. The executive's mind replayed the irony of the moment. He was not only a paying passenger, he was a leader, a man who had built a career through intelligence, resilience, and relentless effort. Yet here, in this microcosm of society, the staff's behavior was proof that accomplishment did not shield him from prejudice. They did not see the executive, they saw only the color of his skin, and in their narrow vision, that was reason enough to laugh. The scene unfolded quietly, but the sting was sharp, cutting through the very promise of equality that spaces like the VIP cabin were supposed to represent. The laughter continued in hushed waves, each one a reminder that respect was conditional in their eyes. It was not about his suit, his ticket, or his credentials. Their reaction was about identity, and in their mocking tones, they revealed their own ignorance more than anything else. Yet the executive sat still, letting them expose themselves through their behavior. Every chuckle, every whispered remark, was being silently catalogued, and he knew that at some point, their underestimation would turn against them. They thought they were safe in their small bubble of mockery, assuming their laughter carried no consequence, blind to the fact that their target was not just any man but someone far more powerful and aware than they could imagine. Hidden bias often does not announce itself loudly, it seeps in quietly, in whispers, in subtle actions, in the kinds of looks exchanged that are not written into any manual but live in the unspoken rules of society. The executive sitting in the VIP section knew this better than most. His life and career had been marked by countless encounters where respect was given sparingly, as though it needed to be earned twice over simply because of the color of his skin. On this flight, the behavior of the staff was not a one-off slip in professionalism. It was the surface crack of a much deeper pattern, one that revealed how prejudice lingers, even in environments where rules, standards, and expectations of equality are supposed to be the highest. The flight staff carried themselves with practiced poise, the kind taught in training sessions and reinforced by corporate values. They smiled at passengers, offered assistance, and performed their duties with precision. Yet beneath the surface, a different current ran. That current revealed itself in the way their tone shifted when addressing some passengers compared to others, in the way their eyes lingered just a second longer when someone who did not match their expectations of VIP walked past. Hidden bias was not about blatant insults, it was about a system of tiny cuts, each one disguised as harmless, each one leaving its mark. The executive recognized that the laughter directed at him did not exist in a vacuum. It came from assumptions formed long before he ever stepped onto that plane. To the staff, his presence disrupted their ingrained picture of who a VIP passenger should be. Their amusement was rooted in disbelief, in the quiet stereotype that blackness and executive success did not belong in the same sentence. They did not need to say it outright, their expressions and muffled chuckles said it for them. The most striking part was not what they did, but how natural it seemed for them to do it, as though their reaction was instinct rather than a conscious decision. In that moment, the executive felt the weight of history pressing in. For decades, hidden bias had shaped the opportunities people like him could or could not have, dictating which rooms they were invited into, which positions they were trusted with, and which spaces they were excluded from. Even when progress had been made, prejudice had not disappeared, it had simply changed its form, slipping into subtler, more socially acceptable disguises. What the flight staff displayed was exactly that, a prejudice so normalized that it could hide under a veil of casual laughter. They might have convinced themselves it was harmless, but to the man in the seat, it was a reminder of how deeply inequality could run. Passengers nearby may not have noticed, but the executive was attuned to the signs. Hidden bias is not always visible to everyone, it often reveals itself most clearly to those who are its targets. He could feel it in the staff's uneven distribution of attention. He could see it in the way their politeness was tinged with condescension when directed toward him, compared to the genuine warmth shown to others. The irony was that these same attendants likely prided themselves on being fair and professional. In their minds, they were doing their jobs as expected. That is what makes hidden bias so insidious. It operates beneath awareness, cloaked in normalcy, expressed through behaviors that are easy to dismiss when called out. The executive remained still, not because he accepted the behavior, but because he understood it too well. Confronting hidden bias in the moment rarely produced change, it often invited defensiveness or denial. He knew this, and so he chose silence, allowing the situation to unfold without resistance. His silence was not compliance, it was observation. He was watching, measuring, taking note of every signal the staff revealed. The bias might have been hidden in their eyes, their whispers, their laughter, but to him it was plain as day. The thing about hidden bias is that it thrives on assumption. The staff assumed he would not notice, that he would not care, or that he would not have the power to challenge them if he did. They assumed his presence was an anomaly rather than a rightful placement. Those assumptions guided their behavior more than any conscious choice. The executive, however, was a man accustomed to dismantling assumptions. He had spent his career turning disbelief into acknowledgement, transforming underestimation into recognition. Here, on this flight, the staff had no idea that their casual prejudice was not invisible to him. On the contrary, it was illuminated by their every action, a clear reminder of how bias hides in plain sight, shaping the way people are seen and treated even in spaces that claim to value equality. The executive sat in his seat with an outward calm that masked the storm inside him. His years of experience had taught him the value of restraint, the power of silence, and the importance of controlling the narrative when others tried to write it for him. He had walked into boardrooms where his competence was questioned before he ever spoke, stood in negotiations where his authority was underestimated, and faced moments where dignity was tested by subtle or direct prejudice. Each of those experiences had carved into him a discipline of silent strength, an ability to stand steady when others tried to shake him. On this flight, when the laughter of the staff sought to undermine his presence in the VIP section, he chose once again to lean on that strength. His silence was not weakness. It was strategy. He understood that every eye in the cabin did not need to see his frustration, because frustration would play into the narrative others were silently writing about him. To lose composure would confirm their assumptions, to demand respect in anger would make them dismiss him as overreacting, to respond with hostility would make them label him as difficult. Instead, he leaned back, his posture straight, his expression unshaken, and his demeanor carrying the weight of someone who had nothing to prove. The staff might have thought their laughter went unchecked, but in truth, he was writing the story in that very moment, not them. What makes silent strength so powerful is that it forces others to confront themselves. The attendants expected some kind of visible reaction, something to validate their mockery or fuel their continued amusement. When it did not come, their laughter began to sound hollow, their whispers less confident, their glances more uneasy. Strength does not always roar, sometimes it rests in stillness, in the refusal to give those who mock you the satisfaction of seeing you flinch. That refusal was what gave the executive the upper hand without lifting a finger. He adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate precision, a small gesture that spoke volumes. It reminded anyone watching that he was not a man out of place, but someone fully belonging to the space he occupied. Every detail about him communicated presence, his attire, his composure, his unshaken demeanor. Where others might have been rattled, he sat grounded, aware that true power rarely announces itself loudly. His strength lay not only in his ability to endure the moment but in his ability to do so with grace. The passengers around him may not have noticed the full extent of what was happening, but the executive knew that perception mattered. In every space he entered, he carried not just his own reputation but the weight of representation. People like him were often judged collectively, and one misstep could be used to justify 100 prejudices. That reality was unfair, but he understood it and had mastered the art of moving with dignity even under pressure. On that flight, his calm composure became his weapon. The staff's behavior might have revealed bias, but his strength revealed character. There is a kind of authority that comes from position, and another that comes from presence. The executive embodied both. His professional achievements gave him status, but it was his calm, steady strength that commanded quiet respect even from those who sought to belittle him. By choosing silence over confrontation, he let the staff's actions stand in contrast to his own demeanor. Their whispers looked small against his steadiness, their laughter petty against his composure. In that contrast, the imbalance of dignity was exposed. Inside, of course, he was not untouched. Silent strength does not mean the absence of feeling, it means the mastery of it. He felt the sting of disrespect, the sharpness of prejudice, the weight of yet another reminder that success does not shield one from bias. But instead of letting those emotions dictate his behavior, he held them close, folded them into the armor he had worn for years. That armor did not make him numb, it made him deliberate. Every reaction was measured, every choice intentional, every expression carefully aligned with the greater purpose of showing who he truly was. The attendants did not realize that their laughter was only strengthening his resolve. Each chuckle became fuel, each whisper became a reminder of why he carried himself the way he did. His life had taught him that respect earned through composure is far more lasting than respect demanded through anger. He knew that patience often reveals more than confrontation ever could. On that flight, his greatest power was not in speaking back, but in embodying a strength so unshakable that it forced the mockery to collapse under its own weight. The moment arrived when the executive decided that silence alone was no longer enough. He had watched, measured, and absorbed the weight of the laughter and whispers from the flight attendants, but he also knew that there comes a point when dignity is not just about composure, it is about response. His next move was not one born of anger or impulse, but of calculation, crafted with the precision of someone who understood both his own power and the ignorance of those who underestimated him. The attendants thought they were in control of the situation, hiding their prejudice beneath casual giggles, but the executive knew how to turn the stage against them. He waited until the cabin had settled, until the other passengers were comfortably seated, and the initial bustle of boarding had eased into a quiet anticipation for takeoff. Then, with deliberate calm, he reached into his leather briefcase and retrieved a folder embossed with the unmistakable logo of the very airline he was flying on. The gesture itself was subtle, but the sight of that folder immediately shifted the energy. The attendants who had mocked him earlier exchanged quick, uneasy glances. They recognized it. It was not the kind of document an average passenger carried. This was corporate-level material, the sort of paperwork reserved for executives, shareholders, or decision-makers. Without saying a word, he opened the folder on his lap, adjusted his glasses, and began reviewing the documents inside as though the cabin was merely his office in the sky. Every movement was intentional. His posture, the careful way he turned each page, the way he highlighted certain lines, it all radiated authority. He was not just a man in a suit sitting in VIP, he was a man whose very presence carried weight within the company's ecosystem. The attendants who had mocked him began to fidget, their earlier confidence slipping. The laughter that once came so easily now seemed out of place, almost inappropriate in the shadow of what they were beginning to realize. The executive did not need to confront them directly. His move was powerful precisely because it was indirect. By simply revealing, without words, that he had a deeper connection to the airline than they could have imagined, he turned the dynamic upside down. The attendants who saw him as an outsider suddenly had to reconsider who he might be. Was he a partner? A senior stakeholder? A consultant with influence? Their imaginations began to fill in the blanks, and in doing so, they silenced themselves more effectively than any outburst ever could have. Passengers nearby began to notice too. They saw the folder, the focused demeanor, the quiet professionalism, and they drew their own conclusions. To them, the man who had been the subject of hidden mockery was clearly someone of significance. Some glanced curiously, others respectfully, and in that shift of perception, the attendants found themselves exposed. The very passengers they were meant to impress with their service were now witnessing a contrast between the executive's composed authority and their own earlier lapses in professionalism. The power of the move lay in its subtlety. The executive did not raise his voice, did not demand apologies, did not make a scene. Instead, he used presence as a weapon, turning the very assumptions used against him into tools for his advantage. The attendants had laughed because they believed he did not belong, his move showed that he belonged more than they could have imagined. In fact, he might have belonged to a level of authority far above their own. That realization unsettled them, not because he had humiliated them outright, but because he had revealed their own smallness without speaking a single word. For the executive, this was not just about personal pride. His calculated action served a deeper purpose. Every time he encountered prejudice, he understood that his response carried lessons, not just for those directly involved, but for everyone who observed. On that plane, his move demonstrated that dignity and intelligence could dismantle bias more effectively than confrontation. He knew that the attendants would remember this moment, that their laughter would echo in their minds long after the flight, not as a joke but as a mistake. He also knew that the passengers who saw the quiet shift would carry with them a story about the black executive who turned prejudice into silence with nothing more than composure and a well-timed display of authority. The attendants tried to recover their professionalism, suddenly more attentive, their tones more formal, their behavior sharpened by the awareness of their earlier error. They moved carefully now, measuring every word, conscious of the man they had underestimated. The balance of power in the cabin had shifted entirely, and it had done so without a raised voice or a direct accusation. The executive had simply made a move that spoke louder than any confrontation could. The cabin, once filled with the casual hum of voices and the subtle echoes of laughter, began to fall into a strange quiet. It was not the ordinary silence that comes with passengers settling into their routines before takeoff. This was a silence that carried weight, a silence born out of realization, discomfort, and the undeniable presence of authority that the executive radiated without saying a single word. The attendants who had earlier shared whispered jokes now avoided eye contact. Their footsteps became brisk and purposeful, their interactions stiff and overly formal, as if correcting themselves mid-performance. The executive had not demanded this change, it had simply unfolded naturally, a response to the way his quiet composure exposed the contrast between their prejudice and his strength. The silence spread like a ripple, and passengers began to sense it too. Those seated nearby glanced toward the executive, curiosity etched into their faces. They had not heard the laughter, but they could feel the shift in energy. Where once the attendants had moved with careless ease, now they carried a visible tension, their politeness sharpened to an almost exaggerated degree. It did not take much for people to notice when something unspoken lingered in the air, and here, it was clear that the dynamics had changed. The executive, without lifting his voice, had transformed the cabin into a space where his dignity commanded attention. The attendants tried to mask their unease by leaning harder into their duties. They offered refreshments with mechanical precision, checked overhead compartments, and spoke to passengers with scripted cheerfulness. Yet beneath the surface, their earlier confidence had crumbled. They were not laughing anymore. Instead, they were calculating every move, aware that their behavior was being watched, not only by the man they had underestimated but by others who might pick up on their faltering professionalism. The very silence they had unintentionally created was now a mirror reflecting their own actions back at them. The executive remained steady, his eyes calmly focused on the documents in front of him, his posture never wavering. He did not need to speak, because the silence was already speaking for him. Each time an attendant passed by, the weight of unspoken accountability pressed harder against them. Their whispers had once filled the air with condescension, but now they had been replaced by a quiet that forced them to reckon with themselves. The sound of laughter, so easy at the start, now seemed out of place, almost shameful in hindsight. For the passengers, the scene was layered in meaning. Some noticed only fragments, the respectful distance the attendants now kept, the way their tone shifted around the executive, the subtle tension that clung to their movements. Others pieced together more, sensing that something deeper had transpired, even if they had not witnessed its beginning. Regardless of what they understood, the silence told them enough. It framed the executive as someone of stature, someone who carried an invisible gravity that could alter the atmosphere of a room, or in this case, an entire cabin. The silence grew most noticeable during routine interactions. When the attendants approached to offer drinks, their voices were softer, their gestures more precise, their eyes careful not to linger too long. It was as if they were trying to erase the memory of what they had done, overcompensating with politeness in the hope of restoring balance. But balance had already shifted. The executive's quiet strength had created an environment where their every move reminded them of the line they had crossed. The cabin no longer belonged to their authority, it belonged to the dignity of the man they had tried to diminish. The executive understood the power of this silence. It was not empty. It was full of reflection, of tension, of the kind of awareness that creeps in when people realize they have made a mistake they cannot undo. He did not need to point fingers or call out their behavior, the silence was doing it for him. It was exposing the gap between their actions and the standards they were meant to uphold. It was forcing them to see him not as the subject of their laughter but as the center of their unspoken respect. Every passing minute deepened that silence. What had begun as mockery had turned into discomfort, and discomfort had turned into reverence. The attendants now moved with the kind of care one reserves for someone important, someone whose opinion carries weight, someone who could alter the course of their careers with a single report. They no longer saw him as a target of ridicule but as a figure of authority they could not afford to misjudge again. For the executive, this transformation was not surprising. He had seen it before in different forms, in meetings, in business deals, in social encounters where initial doubt gave way to recognition once his true standing became clear. The difference here was that the shift was so visible, so immediate, and so complete. The silence itself became proof of his strength. Where words might have been forgotten or dismissed, this quiet carried a permanence. It was etched into the atmosphere of the flight, impossible to ignore, undeniable in its presence. The silence on the flight did not fade quickly. It lingered, weaving itself into every movement, every glance, every interaction that followed. What had started as laughter at a man they thought did not belong had turned into a lesson that stretched far beyond the walls of the aircraft. The attendants, who once believed they held control of the situation, now found themselves subdued by the weight of their own actions. Their behavior, once so casual, now felt out of place in the face of the executive's dignity. What they had intended as humor had unraveled into shame, and the atmosphere itself carried the truth they could no longer deny. The executive's response, or rather, his deliberate restraint, spoke louder than any confrontation could have. He had not raised his voice, had not demanded apologies, had not made a scene. Instead, his silence and subtle assertion of presence had exposed the prejudice in a way words never could. In that moment, every person who noticed, whether staff or passenger, was forced to reflect on what they had seen. The attendants learned that dignity cannot be mocked without consequence, that bias carries weight, and that the people they dismiss may be far greater than their narrow assumptions allow. The lesson that echoed went beyond the crew. Other passengers who observed the shift understood, perhaps subconsciously, that respect is not negotiable. They had watched as a man was quietly mocked and then watched as the same man commanded an authority that silenced the very people who had laughed at him. For them, the story became a reminder that appearances deceive, and that character and success cannot be measured by stereotypes. The whispers and chuckles of the attendants had seemed harmless at first, but by the end of boarding, they stood exposed as unprofessional, small, and unjust. For the attendants themselves, the lesson was sharper, more personal. They had underestimated the wrong man. Their actions had been careless, born of prejudice hidden beneath a thin layer of supposed professionalism, but now they had to confront the fact that their target was not powerless. He was someone whose authority could extend into their world, whose voice, if raised in the right circles, could alter the course of their careers. More than that, they had to sit with the knowledge that they had failed to meet the standards they were trained to uphold, that they had betrayed the very values their uniforms were meant to represent. The executive, still calm and composed, embodied a truth that cut deeper than any reprimand. He showed that strength is not always about confrontation, but about choosing the path that elevates dignity over conflict. His demeanor taught a lesson in patience, in calculated restraint, and in the quiet kind of power that speaks louder than anger. By refusing to descend to the level of those who mocked him, he forced them to rise, or be revealed for what they truly were. It was a reversal so complete that it reshaped the cabin into a space of reflection. Every movement from that point forward carried the imprint of the moment. The attendants poured drinks more carefully, addressed him with heightened respect, and treated the surrounding passengers with a renewed seriousness, as if hoping to cover their earlier missteps. The passengers, too, adjusted their perception, no longer seeing him as just another traveler but as someone whose presence had shifted the very tone of the flight. The silence that had filled the air earlier transformed into a quiet recognition, unspoken but palpable, that something profound had taken place. The lesson extended even further, touching on the larger truth of how prejudice operates in everyday life. The story unfolding in that cabin mirrored what happens in boardrooms, workplaces, and social circles across the world. Hidden bias, casual mockery, and underestimation thrive until someone strong enough, composed enough, and wise enough forces them into the light. The executive had not set out to teach this lesson when he boarded the plane, but through his actions, he had created a moment that would linger in memory long after landing. The attendants would remember the unease that silenced their laughter. The passengers would remember the calm strength that commanded their respect. And the executive himself, though no stranger to such moments, carried yet another example of how dignity, when guarded fiercely and displayed with intelligence, can transform prejudice into its own undoing. The silence that followed his move was not empty, it was filled with the echoes of a lesson learned, a truth exposed, and a reminder that respect is never optional.